Hi everyone, today I'll be presenting my dissertation, which is titled Provable and Control-Theoretic Methods for Deep Object Pose Estimation. So I'll start off with an introduction. This dissertation will consider deep neural networks, which have historically been tied to the task of image classification. So image classification is when you try to automatically determine which class of objects an image belongs to. So it could be a rose, pineapple, or mountain bike, for example. Historically, there have been a lot of methods to approach this problem, so different computer functions and algorithms. One method for approaching this problem is using neural networks. So prior to 2012, neural networks were actually not a popular approach for this task, but that started to change around 2012 when neural networks started outperforming other methods in the task of image classification. In particular, they used to hold this competition called the ImageNet Large-Scale Visual Recognition Challenge. And at the 2012 edition of that competition, a team from the University of Toronto submitted a network they called AlexNet, and AlexNet ended up winning the competition, and not just winning, but winning by a large margin. So ever since then, there's been this explosion of interest in using deep neural networks for image classification, other image processing tasks, and a variety of other machine learning applications. So the way that image classification is represented by a computer is that you have an image which is represented by a set of three matrices, which correspond to red, green, and blue color channels. And the way a label is represented is by this label vector, where each element of the vector corresponds to a possible class, and to denote that an image belongs to a certain class, you set the corresponding element of the vector equal to 1, and everything else equal to 0. So a neural network is really just a function. We can call it a function f, which maps an image x to a label vector y. And this function has a bunch of parameters p, which determine the shape of the function. And so I'll go over some terminology here. The reason it's called a neural network is because these functions were originally somewhat inspired by how the brain was thought to work, but nowadays that connection is pretty loose. A feed-forward neural network is when the function f consists of a composition of functions, so that the input x is processed sequentially until you arrive at the output. And a deep neural network is when there are many functions in this composition. And so deep is not really a precise term, but most of the neural networks that people are using these days can be considered deep. So neural networks are best fit functions. The way you get a neural network to actually give you good results is that you start with a set of training data, which is a bunch of images with known labels, and then you create an error function which measures the difference between the true labels of the data and the network's prediction of the labels. And then you do gradient descent of that error function with respect to the parameters of the network in order to get low error. And so this is a non-convex high-dimensional optimization problem. So you might ask, well, why does this even work? And the reason it works is because people have sort of played around with these functions for many years in order to get them to work, but mathematically they're not well understood. And so it's important to stress that neural networks are not very well understood theoretically or mathematically. In addition to classification networks, there are also pose estimation networks. Pose estimation networks are similar to classification networks. You have a neural network f, which inputs an image x, and instead of outputting a label vector y, it'll output a pose, and by pose we just mean position and orientation. And so with that, the motivation of this dissertation is that deep neural networks often work well, but are not theoretically well understood, and that's due to their nonlinear high-dimensional functions. And so this lack of theoretical understanding raises concerns when applying neural networks in real-world applications, for example, safety-critical applications. A good example is autonomous driving, for which they currently rely upon deep neural networks for navigation. And so with that, the goals of this dissertation will be to develop new provable methods of analysis for neural networks, and also to analyze the specific task of deep object pose estimation using the framework of control theory, which provides a rigorous mathematical framework for analysis. And so I'll present 4 areas of research in this presentation. These can also be viewed as new contributions. The first is to study pose estimation using the framework of observability from control theory. The second is to develop an unscented filter to improve estimates from a pose estimation neural network in the situation in which we're estimating an object with known dynamics. Third, we'll develop a method to compute sensitivity bounds for neural networks with ReLU activation functions. And fourth, we'll develop a provable bound on the sensitivity of pose estimation neural networks. So the first area of research is the observability of the pose estimation problem. So in this section, we'll consider the problem of pose estimation and fit this problem into the framework of control theory by letting our state be the pose of the object and our measurement be the entire camera image of the object. And then we'll apply the observability gradient to analyze this system. So we consider this problem of pose estimation, which is based on a camera image. We try to determine the pose of an object in that image. So the car, for example. We can write the pose as position XYZ in rotation matrix R. So as I said, we'll fit this problem into a state space formulation, where the state is the pose of the object, and the measurement is the camera image, and then we'll apply the observability gradient to analyze this system. So the observability gradient can be derived from an LTV system. The unforced state evolves according to the state transition matrix phi, and with phi we can define the observability gradient as this integral. So in cases in which the dynamics or measurement function are complex, then it's really difficult to work with this integral directly. In other cases, we might not even know the dynamics or measurement function, but we might be able to simulate them. So that's the case in this problem because our measurement function describes how an object in the 3D world is distilled into a camera image, which is a very complex relationship. So in these cases, we can use a numerical approximation of the observability gradient called the empirical observability gradient. So to calculate the empirical observability gradient, we start with an initial nominal state. We then perturb that state in both the positive and negative directions for each element of the state vector. We integrate each of those initial conditions, run each of those trajectories through the measurement function, and then form this matrix delta y, which is found by taking the difference of the corresponding positive and negative measurements. And then we write the empirical observability gradient w hat as this integral. So the main point here is that the empirical observability gradient is a numerical approximation of the observability gradient, and that's what we'll use to analyze this problem. So as I said, we'll fit this problem into a state space formulation. The state will be the pose of the object, which we write as xyz, theta x, theta y, theta z, where theta x, theta y, theta z are independent rotations about the x, y, and z axes. The measurement is the camera image, which is a stack of 3 matrices, but we can just reshape it into a vector to get our measurement vector. So this is what it looks like applying the empirical observability gradient to this problem. On the left we have the nominal pose of an object. On the right we have positive and negative perturbations of that pose for each of the 6 states. So these perturbations are shown larger than what we actually use, just for illustrative purposes. And we generate these images synthetically using the computer program Blender, which allows us to generate photorealistic images, precisely control things like lighting and the pose of the object, and also generate a lot of images very quickly, which saves a lot of time instead of trying to do this experimentally. And so with that, we can now apply the empirical observability gradient. This is a static example, so we're considering a non-moving object. On the left, we have the nominal pose, and on the right, we have the empirical observability gradient. There's a lot of information we can extract from this matrix, but one thing is that the diagonal elements represent how much changing each of the states independently will change the corresponding camera image. So we can see that the last diagonal element is the smallest, and that's because the last state corresponds to rotations about the vertical axis, and since the object is nearly symmetric about that axis, then the image won't change very much. So a main point here is that the observability gradient captures not just the yes-no question of is the system observable or not, but also these relative degrees of observability. So we can also apply this to an object with dynamics. So we have a nominal trajectory on the left. We can calculate the empirical observability gradient on the right, and we can extract similar information from this matrix. We can also apply this methodology to compare poses of the same object. In this figure, we sample 200 poses of a chair, calculate the gradient for each one, and then compare the gradients with respect to measures such as determinant, trace, minimum eigenvalue, and condition number. And particularly, if we look at the determinant and trace, we can see that the max measures correspond to views of the chair which sort of show the full geometry of the chair and have a lot of information, and the minimum measures correspond to views where the chair sort of becomes a 3D blob and there's not a lot of information. The last thing we do in this section is define an idea which we call an image indistinguishable perturbation, which is a perturbation of the object for which the image does not change. So we formalize this idea using a lemma and theorem. We say that in the case of a static camera and object, an image indistinguishable perturbation, and more specifically, a rotational perturbation about an object's axis of symmetry, correspond to a vector in the null space of both the measurement matrix C and observability gradient W. Okay, so on to the second area of research. The topic of this section is unscented filtering pose-estimation neural networks. So in this section, we'll actually start to work with pose-estimation neural networks. So this video helps illustrate the motivation of this section. This is a video from 2018 where they develop a pose-estimation neural network. You can see that the results are pretty good, but they're not perfect. The estimates kind of jump around a little bit, and specifically if you look at the yellow mustard bottle, you can see that there's one orientation at which he holds it for which the network makes some pretty bad estimates. And so with that, the goal of this section will be to consider an object with rigid body dynamics. And so we have a video of the object on the left. We'll consider this soup can to be our object of interest, which has sort of been tossed into the air. And then we'll feed those frames of the video into the network to get estimates of pose. Those estimates won't be perfect, so then we'll implement an unscented filter based on the dynamics of the object in order to improve the estimates. So this concept can be described by this diagram. So we have an image which gets input to a network which outputs a pose estimate. That estimate gets fed into an unscented filter which outputs a state and covariance estimate, and then we iterate through each frame of the video. So these are the equations we used for the unscented filter. There's a lot of equations here, but these are mostly just the standard equations for an unscented filter. One modification we did have to make is to deal with 3D rotations, which have a manifold structure. We parameterized rotation using exponential coordinates, and so we had to modify the steps of the filter in a few places in order to accurately incorporate full 3D rotations into the filter using exponential coordinates. And so for our simulation methodology, we used the image rendering program Blender, which I talked about earlier, to generate synthetic images. And the pose estimation network we used is called DOPE, which is the network from the video I showed. And so in order to implement the filter, we need to know the mean and covariance of the measurement noise. So the measurement comes from the network, so it would be really difficult to write the measurement noise as an actual equation. So instead of doing that, we use a sampling approach, where we sample a bunch of images of the object, feed each of the images into the network to get estimates, and then calculate the sample mean and covariance using the equations on the right. So then we get these values, which are what we use in the filter. So now we can implement the filter and do a simulation. On the left we have the raw video, in the middle we have the network estimate, and on the right we have the filter estimate. It's a little hard to tell from the video, but the filter generally improves the network estimate. Specifically, there's one point in the trajectory where the network makes a bad estimate, but the filter smooths it out. So this is more obvious if we look at a plot. So on the top right we have position error. So we can see that the neural network has a spike in error, but the filter smooths that error out. And on the bottom right we have rotation error, and in this case the filter does an even better job of improving the rotation error and cuts the error in about half. So we can also plot the 3 sigma bounds as determined by the filter. And the filter not just gives us an estimate of position and orientation, but translational and angular velocity as well, and so we can plot those too. And so that was just for one trajectory. The final thing we do is consider 100 random trajectories, run each trajectory through the filter, and then compare the results. And we found that the filter improved the position estimate for 83% of the trials, and improved the orientation estimate for 85% of the trials. So the third area of research is analytical bounds on the local Lipschitz constants of ReLU networks. So in this section, we're going to consider some of the basic equations of which neural networks are composed. So our analysis will be very general in the sense that it can be applied to classification networks, pose estimation networks, as well as other varieties of networks. So the motivation of this section is that neural networks can be very sensitive. So shortly after the deep learning revolution began around 2012, it was discovered that neural networks can have very high sensitivity. So this figure is from 2014, where they have a classification network. The images in the left-hand column are images that correctly classify as school bus, prairie chicken, and palace. And then they generate these very small perturbations and perturb the images to get the images in the right-hand column. And these perturbed images, to the human eye, look exactly the same, but if you run these through the neural network, they all misclassify as class ostrich. So this is kind of a funny example, but it has serious implications for using neural networks in the real world. For example, if you're using a neural network for autonomous driving, and the network misclassifies a stop sign as part of a building, or a pedestrian as part of the road, then obviously that could have catastrophic consequences. And so with that, the goal of this section will be to analyze the sensitivity of neural networks. Unfortunately, this analysis is difficult because neural networks are high-dimensional, nonlinear functions, which makes it really tricky. But one tool for analyzing the sensitivity of neural networks is Lipschitz constants. Lipschitz constants describe the maximum change in the output of a function with respect to a change in the input. There are two main varieties: global Lipschitz constants, which are taken with respect to all possible inputs, and local Lipschitz constants, which are taken with respect to a nominal input x0 and a set of permissible inputs script x. So for the global Lipschitz constant, the only bound that can be computed on it for large networks is very conservative. So the goal in this section will be to consider the local Lipschitz constant. By only considering a particular set of inputs, we'll be able to generate tighter sensitivity bounds for a network. So neural networks are just implemented in code, so you can define the functions to be whatever you want them to be. But in practice, there's only a handful of functions that are fundamentally used in neural networks. So those would be convolution, max pooling, fully connected, and normalization. And it turns out that 3 of these 4 are affine functions, which means they can be written as ax plus b, where A is a matrix and x and b are vectors. And so we have affine and max pooling functions as these 2 main neural network functions. On top of that, affine functions are often followed by an activation function, and the most common activation function is called the rectified linear unit, or ReLU, which is just the max of 0 in the input x. And so that gives us these 2 fundamental functions, which are sort of the building blocks of deep neural networks. So in this section, what we'll do is calculate bounds on the local Lipschitz constants of these 2 functions, and then once we do that, we can generate a bound on the local Lipschitz constant of the entire network. So starting with affine ReLU functions, these functions can be visualized by this diagram. So on the left we have a set of inputs x, which is bounded in magnitude by epsilon. We pass that through the affine function, which generates the ellipsoid in blue. We then bound that ellipsoid using y bar, which is an element-wise bound. And then we pass the blue region through the ReLU function, which turns it into the red region. And so, skipping a lot of math in the interest of time, we can create a bound on the local Lipschitz constant of this function, shown in the equation at the bottom here. And so this bound is the matrix norm of matrix R times A times D, where R is a diagonal matrix of the local Lipschitz constants of the ReLU functions, taken with respect to the vector y bar from the previous slide. A is the matrix from the affine transformation ax plus b, and D is a diagonal binary matrix, which we call a domain restriction matrix, which is kind of a bookkeeping thing to keep track of certain elements in the input set that we know are always 0. And so the other function is max pooling. So given a particular input x, max pooling can be written as a binary matrix transformation. So with that insight and the insight that max pooling functions are piecewise linear, we can do some analysis and determine that the Lipschitz constant of max pooling functions is the square root of nmax, where nmax is the maximum number of pooling regions that any input element is part of. In summary, we've derived bounds on the Lipschitz constants of affine ReLU and max pooling functions. So the next step will be to use these bounds to determine a bound on the entire network. So that process is described by this algorithm. So there are a lot of steps here, but the main idea is that we start with a bound on the input of the network. We then iterate through each layer of the network. Depending on which type of layer it is, we calculate the local Lipschitz bound, and then using that bound, we can determine a bound on the output of the layer. And a bound on the output of the layer is also a bound on the input of the next layer. And so then we can go to the next layer and do the same thing. Determine a Lipschitz bound, and then update the bound for the next layer, and so on and so forth until we get through every layer of the network. And then at the end, we can calculate the network Lipschitz bound by multiplying all the layer bounds together. And so now we can apply this technique to an actual network. On the left we have a nominal input image, and on the right we have our bounds, which depend on the size of the input perturbation we're considering. So these results are for the network AlexNet, which I mentioned earlier. The global bound is shown in red, and the local bound, which we compute, is shown in blue. We can see that as the input perturbation size increases, the local bound approaches the global bound. But for small perturbations, the local bound is significantly lower than the global bound, which is a good thing because that means we have a much tighter bound on the sensitivity of the network. So the next question would be, well, what can we actually do with this bound? So we can apply this bound to image classification networks to determine bounds on minimum adversarial perturbations. So adversarial perturbations are perturbations of an image that cause the network to misclassify, which is represented on that slide I showed earlier with the images of the school bus, prairie chicken, and palace. So on the bottom row are global bounds computed by the global method, and above that are local bounds computed by our method. And so our local bounds are larger than the global bounds, which means they're tighter. And so in plain English, these bounds tell us that an input perturbation must be at least this large in order to change the classification of the network. Okay, so on to the final area of research, which is on the topic of sensitivity bounds for pose estimation neural networks. So in this section, we're going to consider a similar type of sensitivity analysis as we did in the previous section, but we're going to consider this specifically for pose estimation neural networks. So we can write a pose estimation network as a function f, which maps an input image x into a rotation parameter p. And in reality, a pose estimation network will output a pose, which consists of position and rotation, but the pose will often be a concatenation of position and rotation, so we can basically split the network and consider the rotation portion separately. And so as I mentioned, one of the main tools for analyzing network sensitivity is the Lipschitz constant. And so if we were to apply this Lipschitz constant to this network, then we'd be measuring the Euclidean change of the output of the network, which, since the network outputs rotation parameters, would be the Euclidean distance between two rotation parameters. So that's not a meaningful or proper measure of rotational distance. So for example, if the network outputs quaternions, then you'd be measuring the Euclidean distance between two quaternions, and that's not a proper measure of rotation. So with that, we'll have to consider a proper measure of angular rotation for our sensitivity bound. So we do that using angular distance. The angular distance between two 3D rotations is the angle of direct rotation between the rotations using an axis angle representation. So we denote this function as dist, which maps two parameters to the interval 0 to pi. So for rotation matrices, the dist function will take this form, but for different rotation parameterizations like quaternions or exponential coordinates, the function will take a different form. So with that, we can define our measure of rotational sensitivity for a pose estimation neural network as this expression. So this is almost identical to the Lipschitz constant, except the numerator is now the angular distance between the rotation parameters instead of the Euclidean distance. So ideally, we'd like to determine this value exactly, but that's a little too difficult, so instead we're going to determine an upper bound. Determining an upper bound on this expression is actually not too mathematically intensive. We can basically just apply the chain rule, and we get this equation at the bottom here. So on the left is our sensitivity measure, and on the right is the Lipschitz constant or bound L times this quantity shown in the red circle. This quantity is the maximum angular distance between two parameters with respect to their Euclidean distance. So we know how to calculate a Lipschitz bound L, so all we have to do to get our bound is determine this value in the red circle. Ideally, we could just look this value up, but we're not aware that it's been derived for any rotation parameterization. So our next step will be to go ahead and try to derive this value for different rotation parameterizations. So we'll consider several different rotation parameterizations: exponential coordinates, quaternions, and 2D projected points. Exponential coordinates can be constructed from an axis angle representation, where you multiply the axis by the angle. Quaternions can also be constructed from an axis angle representation, as shown in the equation in the middle. And 2D projected points are when you have points on a 3D object which are projected into the image plane, which gives you your coordinates. And to get from those coordinates to a pose, you have to apply a P&P algorithm, and that algorithm is often a nonlinear optimization that's iterative, so it's just too difficult to try to determine an exact sensitivity value for that parameterization. So instead, we'll just consider exponential coordinates and quaternions. So starting with exponential coordinates, in the top left we have the quantity we need to determine. So this quantity consists of 6 degrees of freedom and 2 constraints, which makes analysis a little tricky. But if we look at it in 2D, we can reduce it to 3 degrees of freedom, and we can write the angular and Euclidean distances as the equations in the bottom left. Then analyzing those equations, we can determine that the quantity in the top left equals 1. Similarly, for quaternions, the quantity we need to determine is in the top left. This quantity consists of 8 degrees of freedom and 2 constraints, but if we look at it in 2D, we can actually write both the angular and Euclidean distances in terms of this variable c, which represents the chord length of the unit circle. So analyzing these equations, we can determine that the quantity in the top left equals pi over the square root of 2. So we did this analysis for exponential coordinates and quaternions, as well as unconstrained versions of both. The sensitivity values we derived are shown in the right-hand column. So what we want to do is create a neural network that outputs one of these parameterizations, and then calculate a sensitivity bound for that network. So 3 of these 4 parameterizations make it tricky to do that, because they either require implementing a constraint on the output of the network, or they have an infinite sensitivity bound. So the only one that really works is unconstrained exponential coordinates. So what we'll do next is create a neural network that outputs rotation in the form of unconstrained exponential coordinates, and then calculate a sensitivity bound for that network. So the network architecture that we use is shown at the bottom. We generated training images synthetically, again using the soupcan object. Then we trained the network and then calculated the sensitivity bound to be 84 times 10 to the 9th, which is a very large bound, but it's expectable because all neural networks are going to have very high sensitivity after you train them. So the next question would be, well, how do we actually use this in practice? So if we rearrange the terms a little, we can determine that if the difference between 2 inputs is less than or equal to 1.1 times 10 to the negative 11th, then the angular distance between the 2 corresponding outputs will be less than 1 radian. And we can also do similar calculations for different bounds on the input. Okay, so now I'll give a short conclusion for all of the work I've presented. So in summary, we developed provable and control-theoretic methods for post-estimation neural networks. We analyzed this problem using several approaches. So we used tools from control theory, such as observability and unscented filtering in the first and second areas of research. And we also performed sensitivity analysis of general neural networks and post-estimation neural networks in the final 2 areas of research. So in terms of future work, there's a lot of different future work we could do which branches out from the different areas of research we've talked about. But I'm just going to mention 2 that tie a lot of those areas together and that we think are very important. So both of these areas of future work have to do with the fact that the sensitivity of neural networks is usually very high, and not just that, but the only sensitivity bounds we can compute for them are very conservative. So it's important to be able to calculate tighter bounds on the Lipschitz constants of neural networks, which is in line with the work we considered in the 3rd area of research with the local Lipschitz constants. The other thing would be to consider reducing a network's sensitivity by constraining the network during training. So if we think back to that last network I showed, which had very high sensitivity, if we were able to constrain that network while we trained it to give it lower sensitivity, then we could get smaller sensitivity bounds, which would be a lot more useful in practice. And so that's the end of the talk. I'd like to thank Professor Morgansen for guiding me through this research and setting me up with a really interesting project that I enjoyed working on. I'd like to thank my committee members for being super helpful throughout this whole process, my fellow lab mates in the NDCL, past and present, as well as other students who I've worked with, faculty and staff, and finally the ONR for funding this research.